arrest her, cuff her, and drag her out. General Everett Caldwell slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. His face had gone dark red, the veins along his neck standing rigid beneath his collar. I don't care if she's got a PhD and a direct line to the president. She walks into my command center and tells me my mission is a fraud. In front of my officers? He stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him. Get her out. Seal every file she touched. If she resists, physically remove her. He had no idea what was underneath that jacket. If you've ever watched someone throw away everything that mattered because their pride was bigger than their judgment, stay with me until the very end of this story. Subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Commander Amelia Voss had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a person could do in a room full of powerful men was to be right. She had learned it the hard way. Not from a textbook, not from a training manual, not from one of those leadership seminars where retired generals stood behind podiums and talked about decision-making frameworks while the audience nodded and checked their watches. She had learned it from a mountainside in a country she was never officially in. From a team of 7 operators who trusted her call when every other signal said retreat. From the silence that followed afterward, the silence of a mission completed, a threat neutralized, and 7 people still breathing who might not have been, and then the silence of the debriefs that followed, where her name appeared nowhere in the documentation. You learn things from silences like that. You learn that being right didn't protect you. You learn that credit moved upward through rank, the way heat moved upward through a room naturally, effortlessly, without anyone having to decide it. You learned that the best thing a person like her could do was stay quiet, stay sharp, and wait. So when she walked into the command center at Fort Adams, Virginia on a Tuesday morning in October, she was not trying to make an impression. She signed in at the security checkpoint. She accepted the visitor badge. She found her assigned seat in the back left corner of the room, the kind of seat that gave her a full view of every face at the main table without putting her own face in anyone's direct line of sight, and she sat down, opened her briefing folder, and began to read. Nobody paid much attention to her, which was exactly how she wanted it. Fort Adams was a serious installation, the kind of place where the air itself felt classified. The corridors were wide and fluorescent lit, and lined with portraits of 4-star generals, going back decades, men with hard eyes and precise postures, and the particular expression of people who had never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. The command center itself was an enormous room built around a central conference table, long enough to seat 20 people, with 2 walls given over entirely to high-resolution screens that could display satellite imagery, real-time communications intercepts, mission overlays, and threat assessments simultaneously. When Amelia arrived, 3 of those screens were already active. She studied them from her corner seat without moving anything but her eyes. The imagery was from somewhere in the southern region of a country that the paperwork carefully never named. Dense terrain, a compound on a hillside. Heat signatures in and around the structures, consistent with a significant number of personnel. She recognized the target designation from the mission briefing she had been handed the previous afternoon. She had spent that evening reading the file 4 times. Not twice, 4 times. Because the first time she read something complicated, she was absorbing the structure. The second time, she was absorbing the details. The third time, she was looking for what was missing. And the fourth time, she was making sure what she thought she was missing was actually missing and not something she had skimmed over. It was missing. The question was why. She was still turning that question over in her mind when General Everett Caldwell walked into the room. He did not enter quietly. There was nothing quiet about General Caldwell. He was a large man, not in terms of physical size. He was perhaps 6 feet, broad in the shoulders but not imposing in any theatrical sense, but large in terms of presence. He moved with the certainty of a person who had spent so many years being the most important person in every room he entered that the certainty had become involuntary. The way breathing was involuntary. His uniform was immaculate. His decorations were significant. His expression was the expression of a man who had already decided how the next 4 hours would go before the room had fully assembled. He took his seat at the head of the table. 2 aides sat flanking him. Several colonels and lieutenant colonels arranged themselves along the sides. An intelligence officer from the Defense Intelligence Agency, a civilian named Harrison, mid-40s with glasses he kept pushing up his nose took a seat near the far end with a laptop already open in front of him. And Amelia Voss sat in her corner, her folder open, her pen in her hand, and her full attention on every face in the room. The briefing began. General Caldwell's lead planner, a colonel named Marcus Webb, walked the room through the mission architecture. The target was a logistics hub used by a regional network that had been responsible for 3 separate attacks on coalition assets over the preceding 8 months. Intelligence confirmed through multiple collection methods. Webb emphasized multiple placed the network's operational leadership at the compound. The window for the strike was narrow. Weather, logistics, and a favorable gap in the enemy's communication security all aligned within the next 72 hours. The plan called for a combined operation. Air assets would establish a perimeter and provide fire support. A ground element, 240 soldiers from 2 different units, would execute the direct action. The whole thing from insertion to extraction was projected to take less than 6 hours. Webb was good at his job. His delivery was measured, confident, and detailed. He handled the visual display smoothly, moving through satellite imagery and schematic overlays with the ease of someone who had done this kind of briefing many times before. When he finished, he turned to General Caldwell and gave a small nod that meant, "It's yours." Caldwell looked around the table. Questions? There was a pause. The kind of pause that happened in rooms where the person asking the question already had a particular answer in mind, and everyone in the room understood that. One colonel raised his concern about extraction timing if the operation ran long. Webb addressed it. A lieutenant colonel asked about a secondary communications asset. Another aide answered. There were 2 or 3 other exchanges, clean and professional, and completely unthreatening to the fundamental shape of the plan. Then the room moved toward consensus. Amelia watched the consensus forming the way you watched a tide coming in. Gradually, inevitably. Each small wave of agreement making the next one a little easier, a little higher. Nobody at the table was lying. Nobody was being cowardly in any simple sense. They were doing what people in rooms like that almost always did, which was to trust the structure they were inside of. The structure said, the general has the plan, the intelligence has been confirmed, the window is narrow, the mission is ready. The structure said, this is how it works. The structure was wrong. Amelia closed her folder. She did not raise her hand. She did not clear her throat. She simply spoke in a voice that was calm enough and clear enough that the first sentence stopped the room without requiring her to raise her volume. General Caldwell, I need to flag something before this moves to execution. The effect was immediate and she had expected it. Heads turned. Some with surprise as if people had forgotten she was there. Some with a particular kind of male instinct expressed itself as mild irritation, the instinct that arose when a meeting was almost finished and someone wanted to reopen it. General Caldwell's gaze moved to the corner where she sat. His expression did not change, but his eyes performed a quick and very practiced assessment rank, insignia, age, gender, the visitor badge, clipped to her left breast pocket, and arrived at a conclusion she had seen many times before in many different faces. Who are you, he said, not rudely exactly, but not warmly. Commander Amelia Voss. I'm assigned to the intelligence review for this operation. The intelligence review. He repeated it in a tone that indicated he was trying to remember whether he had authorized an intelligence review. Yes, sir. I've been working through the collection package for the past 6 days. Another assessment? The colonels at the table were very still, in the particular way that people who understood rank dynamics went still when something unexpected was happening and they weren't sure yet which way it was going to go. What did you want to flag, Commander? This was the moment. She knew it. She had known it would come since the 3rd time she'd read the file. She had known it the way you knew the moment in an operation when the silence changed quality and you understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds was going to determine everything that happened after. The target designation for the compound is based on a collection sequence that runs through 3 separate reporting chains, she said. But when I trace the sourcing on all 3 chains, 2 of them route back to the same originating contact. A single source that's been given 2 different classification markers and cited as independent corroboration. The room was very quiet now, a different quality of quiet than the polite quiet of waiting for the meeting to finish. That's a significant problem for source validation, she continued. But there's a second issue. The heat signatures on the compound imagery, the ones being assessed as consistent with significant personnel presence, were collected on a single date 6 weeks ago. There's been no secondary thermal confirmation since then. What we have is a snapshot. We don't actually know what the compound looks like now. Caldwell hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table. And the third issue, she said, because there was a third issue, is the communication intercept that positions the network leadership at the location. I've been trying to authenticate the intercept for 4 days. The metadata is inconsistent with the collection platform it's attributed to. The intercepts may be genuine, but there's enough in the metadata to raise a serious question about whether they were collected where the report says they were collected, or whether they were introduced into the reporting stream from somewhere else. She stopped. She let that land. The silence stretched. Colonel Webb was the first to speak. Commander, that intelligence package was reviewed and validated through standard D channels before it reached this command. I know it was, she said. That's part of what concerns me. She watched Webb's face. She watched Caldwell's face. She watched the civilian, Harrison, who had stopped typing and was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between concentration and something else. The picture I'm seeing, she said carefully, is of a target package that has been constructed to look robust, but has significant structural problems underneath. I'm not telling you the compound is clean. I don't know what's in the compound. What I'm telling you is that what we think we know about the compound is built on intelligence that hasn't been properly validated. And launching a 240-person operation on intelligence that hasn't been properly validated, Commander. Caldwell's voice was quiet, but it had a temperature to it now. Cool, precise. Are you telling me that you, in 6 days, conducting what you describe as an intelligence review, have identified failures in a collection package that has been through full DIA validation and 3 separate staff reviews? Yes, sir, the word sat in the room. I'd like to see your documentation. I have it here. She opened the folder in front of her. He didn't move to take it. He looked at her for a moment longer. How old are you, Commander? It was the question she had known was coming. She had been asked a version of it in one form or another in almost every significant meeting of her career. It was never quite the right question. Age wasn't the point. The point was always what age was standing in for, which was, who gave you the right to be here? And why should I believe you instead of the people I already trust? 28, sir. She saw the thing happen in his eyes that happened in every room eventually. The calculation, the resetting, the particular configuration of dismissal that wasn't rude enough to be called contempt, but was something adjacent to it, something like a door being very politely closed. Colonel Webb, Caldwell said, without looking away from her, is there anything in the commander's concerns that the staff review didn't address? Webb's answer was immediate. No, sir. Everything she's raising was covered. The source validation, the imagery cadence, the intercept metadata, all of it was within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters, Amelia said quietly. Sir, I understand that's the assessment. I'm asked that the specific concerns I've raised be documented and reviewed before execution. That's all I'm asking. A 48-hour hold on launch while independent verification, the window is 72 hours. Caldwell's voice had a finality to it now. If we wait 48 hours for additional review, we lose the operational window. We lose the target. We lose 8 months of work, and we let a network responsible for American casualties walk away because a junior commander decided the paperwork wasn't perfect. General, this briefing is concluded. He stood. Colonel Webb, proceed to execution planning. Get the ground element commanders in here for a coordination meeting at 1400. He was already moving toward the door, and something in Amelia Voss went very still. Not cold, not angry. She had been cold and she had been angry in moments like this before, and she had learned that neither of those states was useful. What she felt was something closer to a crystalline clarity, the kind that came when you had run out of options and the only thing left was the truth told plainly. General Caldwell, he stopped. Something in her voice made him stop. It wasn't volume. It was certainty, a particular quality of certainty that even he recognized as something different from what had been in the room a moment ago. He turned back. I need you to hear what I'm about to say, she said, not as a formality. Actually hear it. He waited. The operation you are about to execute is a planned ambush. The compound is not a logistics hub. The intelligence that says it is has been manipulated. I don't know exactly who manipulated it or exactly how it entered the reporting stream, but I know what I found when I traced the sourcing, and what I found is that 240 American soldiers are being led toward a target that was designed to draw them in. Not a target they'll neutralize. A trap. The room had stopped breathing. Caldwell stared at her. Then something happened in his face that she recognized but hadn't expected quite so quickly. Not reflection. Not reconsideration. It was something harder than that. Something defensive. The expression of a person whose authority had been challenged in front of witnesses and who had made the calculation almost before the thought had fully formed that he could not afford to be seen, considering some of the possibility that she was right. Military police, his voice was flat and cold. I want this officer escorted from the command center and detained. I want every file she accessed in the past 6 days sealed and inventoried. 2 MPs who had been posted near the entrance moved. Amelia did not move. She sat exactly where she was, her folder in front of her, her hands flat on the table, and she waited. The MPs reached her. One of them put a hand on her shoulder, not rough, but firm, the practiced grip of someone who had done this before. Around the table, nobody spoke. Nobody met her eyes. The colonel stared at the table, or the screens, or somewhere just past her face. Webb looked at his notes. Harrison had closed his laptop. The MP said quietly, "You need to come with us." Amelia looked up at him. He was young, probably 23, 24, with the particular expression of someone following an order he wasn't entirely sure about. "Give me 30 seconds, she said. "Ma'am, 30 seconds. She didn't raise her voice. She looked at General Caldwell across the room. 30 seconds. That's what I'm asking for." Caldwell stared at her. Something was happening in the room. Amelia could feel it. The particular quality of attention that meant that even the people who weren't looking at her were watching. That even the people who had decided she was wrong were wondering why she wasn't panicking. That even General Caldwell, who had given the arrest order without blinking, was looking at her with something that wasn't quite confidence anymore. She reached up slowly, both hands, deliberate. She put her fingers on the collar of the tactical jacket she had worn since entering the building, a plain, unremarkable jacket that nobody had paid any particular attention to, and she began to take it off. "Commander," the MP started again. "I know," she said quietly. The jacket came off, and the room went silent in a way that it had never been silent before. Not the silence of a meeting paused, not the silence of polite disagreement, the silence of something being understood. On the left chest of her uniform, beneath a set of qualifications and specialized training designations that would have required close reading to fully parse, was an insignia that required no close reading at all. The SEAL Trident, the eagle, the anchor, the pistol, the trident. One of the most recognizable symbols in the United States military, and one of the hardest to earn. The MP's hand lifted from her shoulder. Colonel Webb raised his head. One of the lieutenant colonels at the table made a sound that was barely a word, barely even a sound, just the involuntary expression of a recalibration happening faster than speech could keep up with. General Caldwell did not move. His expression did not shift, but something in his eyes changed, something deep and specific. The look of a man who has made a calculation and is now watching the variables he used for that calculation rearrange themselves into something entirely different. Amelia reached into the folder in front of her and removed a single sealed envelope. She opened it. She slid the contents across the table, 3 pages, marked with classification headers that made 2 of the colonels closest to her draw back slightly before they caught themselves. "My name is Commander Amelia Voss," she said. "I hold qualifications in Naval Special Warfare and Special Operations Intelligence. My access level for this review is not analyst grade. My access level is above the classification tier of every document in your mission package." She let that sit for 1 beat. "I didn't tell you this at the beginning of this briefing because I was hoping it wouldn't matter. I was hoping the evidence I put in front of you would be enough on its own, without rank, without title, without credentials. I wanted to know whether the evidence would be seen for what it was." Another beat. It wasn't. "So now I'm telling you." She looked at General Caldwell directly, not defiantly, not with satisfaction, with something much quieter than either of those things. "I'm not trying to embarrass you, General. I'm telling you this because 240 people are running out of time, and the conversation we need to have about what is actually in that intelligence package cannot happen while I'm in handcuffs." The room had not moved. Nobody at the table had moved. The MPs were standing in place, very still, looking at the general with the particular expression of people waiting for an order that would settle what had just happened. Caldwell looked at her credentials. He looked at the classification headers. He looked at the trident. He looked at her. And for the first time since walking into the command center that morning, Everett Caldwell did not look like a man who already knew how the next 4 hours were going to go. He looked like a man who was, very carefully, beginning to consider the possibility that he had been wrong. He did not say it yet, not in words. People like him almost never said it in words, not immediately, not in front of witnesses, not before they had found a way to inhabit the admission that didn't cost them everything they had spent 40 years building. But he looked at the MPs, and he made a small gesture with his hand. Stand down, the MPs stepped back. The room exhaled. And Amelia Voss laid her folder flat on the table and began to speak, because there was a great deal to explain and very little time to explain it. And somewhere beyond the walls of this command center, 240 soldiers were being told to get ready. What she laid out in the next 40 minutes was not a theory. It was not speculation. It was a reconstruction, methodical, specific, and deeply unwelcome of what had actually happened to the intelligence that General Caldwell's entire mission was built on. She started with the source. The original collection, she explained, came from a single human intelligence asset, a contact who had been providing information to a coalition partner for approximately 14 months. That contact's information had been processed and introduced into the American intelligence stream through a channel that was legitimate in its structure, but which had, somewhere along the way, been accessed by someone who understood exactly how to use it. The contact's original reporting, she had determined, had described the compound accurately. The compound was real. The compound was located where the map said it was located. The compound had, at the time of the original reporting, been used by a network element for logistics activity 14 months ago. What had happened in the 14 months since was the problem. Someone had taken the original source reporting and kept it alive, kept it circulating in the reporting stream, kept it being cited as current, kept it being used to generate ongoing intelligence assessments without it ever being freshened with new collection. The source had not been recontacted. The compound had not been resurveilled in any meaningful depth. The heat signatures everyone was pointing to were from a single pass 6 weeks ago, and when she had traced the collection, tasking for follow-up imagery, she found that 3 separate requests for additional passes had been logged and then quietly administratively closed without being executed. Somebody had closed those requests. She showed the room the documentation. The intercepts were more complex. The metadata problem she had raised was real. The collection platform attribution was inconsistent, but the deeper issue was that the intercepts were genuine. They were real communications between real people. They just weren't from the compound. The communications were collected approximately 40 miles from the compound site, she said, in a different terrain type, different elevation, inconsistent with the compound geography. The network leadership that these intercepts are supposed to place at the target, they weren't at the target. They were somewhere else. Somebody moved the attribution in the processing stream. Somebody. That word was doing a great deal of work in the room by now. I don't know who, she said, before anyone could ask. I don't have enough to identify the individual yet. What I know is that the manipulation of this intelligence package required access to 3 separate systems, knowledge of the reporting and validation process, sophisticated enough to make the alterations survive standard review, and a specific operational reason, to want this particular mission to execute against this particular target. Colonel Webb had been very quiet for the past 20 minutes. Now he spoke. You're describing an inside operation? Yes, she said. You're saying someone inside our intelligence architecture deliberately constructed a false target package. Yes, to send 240 American soldiers into a trap, she said, or into a location that isn't what we think it is. I don't know which. Both are serious. The false target is the one I'm certain of. What's waiting at the compound, I don't know. That's what we need to find out before we send anyone there. The room sat with that. General Caldwell had not spoken for quite some time. He was looking at the documentation she had spread across the table, the trace diagrams, the source routing analysis, the metadata comparison, the request logs for the surveillance passes that had been closed without execution. She watched him reading. She watched the particular way a very intelligent person absorbed information that contradicted something they had been certain of. It was not a pleasant thing to watch, and she did not take any satisfaction in it. She had been in rooms where powerful people absorbed information like this before, and she had learned that the outcome was never guaranteed. That some people, when confronted with evidence that their certainty had been misplaced, found ways to reject the evidence rather than the certainty. It was not weakness, exactly. It was something more complicated than weakness. It was the way the mind protected itself when the stakes of being wrong were very high. She waited. Harrison, the DIA civilian, spoke first. General, if what the commander is describing is accurate, and I have to say, the sourcing trace she's presenting is consistent with concerns I raised internally about this package 3 weeks ago. Several heads turned toward Harrison. Then we are looking at a potential penetration of the reporting stream at a fairly high level. That's not a mission planning problem. That's a counterintelligence problem. And the standard protocol when you have a suspected penetration is to halt operations that may have been affected until the scope of the compromise is understood. Caldwell looked at Harrison. You raised concerns 3 weeks ago. Harrison pushed his glasses up. I flagged some anomalies in the source routing. I was told they had been reviewed and cleared. By who? Harrison gave a name that made one of the colonels at the table go very still. The room was quiet again. General Caldwell looked at the documentation in front of him one more time. Then he looked at Amelia Voss. She looked back at him. No satisfaction in her face, no triumph. The same calm she had walked into the room with, the same calm she had maintained through the arrest order, through the MPs, through the credentials revealed a calm that was not indifference and was not performance, but was the particular quality of someone who has learned through real experience in real situations. That clarity serves better than emotion. How long do you need? He asked. To do what, sir? To figure out what's actually in that compound. She thought for a moment. 72 hours to do it properly. 36 if we move aggressively and accept some residual uncertainty. He nodded slowly. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a formal acknowledgement that she had been right and he had been wrong. People like him rarely did that in rooms full of other people. But it was something, a specific and meaningful something that she had learned to recognize and to accept for what it was. He turned to Colonel Webb. Stand down the execution planning. I want a full mission hold effective immediately. Nobody briefs the ground element commanders about a launch until I say otherwise. He looked at Harrison. I want you in my office in 20 minutes. Bring whatever you flagged 3 weeks ago. He looked at the MPs. You're dismissed. He was already moving again. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around entirely. He spoke to the middle distance, to somewhere between the door and the room behind him. Commander Voss, your documentation will be reviewed this afternoon. I would like you present. Yes, he left. The room breathed. Webb was looking at his notes. The colonels were looking at each other and at the table. Harrison was already reaching for his phone. The MPs had gone. One of the lieutenant colonels, a woman Amelia had not heard speak during the entire briefing, met her eyes across the table and held them for a moment. Just a moment. Her expression was not warm exactly, and it was not cold. It was the expression of someone who understood something that was not being said aloud. Amelia gathered her documents back into her folder. She thought about the 240 soldiers who were somewhere on this installation going about the business of preparing for a mission that had just been stood down before they knew it existed. They would be told something, a planning hold, a logistics issue, a timing revision. They would be frustrated. They were trained to execute, and holds felt like failure. They didn't know they had just been pulled back from the edge of something much worse than a delayed mission. They didn't need to know. Not yet. She thought about the person who had constructed the false target package, about the access they would have needed, about the knowledge, about the reason. There was always a reason. The reason was the part that mattered now. The intelligence manipulation was the symptom. The reason was the disease. She closed her folder. She thought about a mountainside in a country she had never officially been in, and about 7 operators who had come home, and about the particular weight of knowing things that never appeared in any document. She had carried that weight for a long time. She would carry this one too, whatever it turned out to be. The stand-down order moved through Fort Adams like a current through water, invisible, immediate, and felt by everyone it touched, before anyone fully understood what had caused it. Colonel Webb spent the first 20 minutes after Caldwell left the command center, standing very still at his end of the table, staring at the mission overlay on the center screen with the expression of a man watching something he had built with his own hands begin to come apart at the joints. He had put 8 months of work into that operation, 8 months of collection synthesis, target analysis, coordination across 3 separate commands, 2 partner nations, and enough bureaucratic friction to break lesser planners. He had believed in the package. He had defended it in front of 4 generals and 2 congressional staffers. He had staked his professional reputation on the certainty that what it described was real. Now, a 28-year-old commander he had never heard of was telling him that the foundation of all of it had been manipulated. He finally looked at Amelia. "You said the source routing traces back to a single contact given two different markers," he said. His voice was controlled, but just barely. "Which processing node introduced the second marker?" She'd been waiting for that question. It was the right question. The fact that he was asking it, rather than continuing to send the package, told her something important about him, that underneath the professional investment and the bruised certainty, there was an actual intelligence officer who understood what was at stake. The second marker was introduced at the regional fusion center level, she said, 18 months ago, before the contact's reporting was ever forwarded to DIA. Webb absorbed that. So the contamination was upstream of every validation layer we ran, every single one. The validators were checking the package against itself. They had no visibility into what happened before it entered the stream. He sat down heavily. "That's not a failure of our process. That's someone who understood our process well enough to get around it." "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what it is." Across the room, Harrison was already on his phone, speaking in the clipped, careful language of someone delivering genuinely bad news to someone who needed to hear it but was not going to enjoy receiving it. He had his laptop open again, and she could see from the angle of the screen that he was pulling up files. She recognized the anomaly reports he had flagged 3 weeks ago that had been reviewed and cleared by someone whose name she now knew. That name was Colonel Dennis Hargrove. Hargrove was not in the command center. He hadn't been in the command center for the briefing, which at the time had seemed unremarkable. He was technically a liaison position, not a core planning staff member, but which now, in light of everything she had laid out in the past 40 minutes, felt like something else entirely. She made a note. The lieutenant colonel who had met her eyes after Caldwell left her nameplate read Vasquez came around the table and stopped beside her chair. She was perhaps 35, with particular bearing of someone who had earned everything she wore on her uniform, through to a sequence of experiences that hadn't been comfortable. "That sourcing trace," Vasquez said quietly. Not quite a whisper, but close to it. "How long did it take you to build it?" 4 days to identify the anomalies. 2 more to trace them back far enough to be certain. 6 days total. Yes. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. "The staff review team had the same package for 3 weeks. I know, they missed everything you found." Amelia didn't answer that directly. She didn't need to. Vasquez wasn't asking a question. She was doing the same thing Amelia had done when she first opened the file. She was running the numbers, feeling the shape what they implied, and not quite ready yet to say the thing they were both thinking. "Will you be in the general's office this afternoon?" Vasquez asked. "I was asked to be." Vasquez nodded once. "Then I'll see you there." She moved away without another word. Webb was on his feet again, pulling the mission overlay off the main screen and replacing it with a source routing diagram he had just constructed on his tablet and pushed to the display. He was working now, the kind of focused, purposeful working that meant he had crossed the line from defending the package to trying to understand what had actually happened to it. He didn't ask for Amelia's help. He didn't need to. She could see him following the same trace she had followed, hitting the same anomalies, arriving at the same conclusions. He got there in 11 minutes. He stood back from the screen and exhaled through his nose a long, controlled breath that carried something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite devastation, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "The fusion center node," he said to no one in particular. Whoever did this, they had access to the fusion center. "And they knew the validation protocol," Amelia said, "and they knew our collection gaps." He turned to look at her. "The surveillance requests that were closed without execution, you said 3 requests were logged and closed. Who had authority to close collection tasking at that level?" It was a short list. She had already built it. 7 people, she said. 3 of them are currently outside the continental United States. 1 is retired. That leaves 3. 3 people who could have closed those tasking requests. 3 people with the access and authority. Whether any of them actually did it, that's what the counterintelligence review will determine. Webb stared at the diagram on the screen. "One of those 3 people was in this building when you walked." "In this morning," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He didn't ask which one. Either he already knew or he wasn't ready to say the name aloud, and she wasn't going to push him. There would be a time for names. That time was General Caldwell's office. With Harrison's documentation and her sourcing trace and whatever the counterintelligence team could pull in the next several hours. She checked her watch. It was 11:43 in the morning. The meeting with Caldwell was at 1400. She had just over 2 hours. She picked up her folder and walked out of the command center. The corridor outside was the same wide fluorescent lit space it had been 2 hours ago, with the same portraits of generals lining the walls, but it felt different now, or she felt different moving through it, which amounted to the same thing. There was a particular quality to the hours after a confrontation like the one she had just come through. A kind of heightened attention, where everything registered more sharply than usual. The sound of boots on the floor 30 feet behind her, the hum of the ventilation system above, the particular smell of an installation that housed too many people doing too many serious things in too little space. She needed to make a call. She found a secure communications room off the main corridor, identified herself to the duty officer, and was inside with the door closed within 4 minutes. She dialed from memory. The line connected on the second ring. Voss. The voice on the other end was a woman's older, precise, with the particular economy of language that came from spending decades in environments where every word either mattered or didn't need to be said. Commander Diane Farrell, Naval Special Warfare Command. Amelia's direct reporting authority for the review assignment. Ma'am, the mission has been stood down. A pause. How long did it take? The briefing started at 09:30. Stand-down order was issued at approximately 11:15. And Caldwell? Amelia considered how to answer that. He gave an arrest order first. Another pause, longer this time. Tell me, she told her. Concisely in the order it happened, without editorializing. Farrell listened without interrupting, which was characteristic of her. She had the rare discipline of actually waiting until a report was complete before beginning to form her response. When Amelia finished, Farrell was quiet for a moment. The Trident reveal, she said finally. Was that your call or did the situation force it? Situation forced it. The MPs were already moving. All right, not criticism, not approval, just filing it. What do you need from this end? I need the counterintelligence team that was pre-positioned for this assignment activated immediately. I have a name Hargrove that needs to be run against the access logs for the Fusion Center node and the collection tasking system going back 18 months. And I need his current physical location confirmed and held without him knowing it's being held. Hargrove. Farrell's voice was very flat. Colonel Dennis Hargrove. Yes, ma'am. He was one of the names on your preliminary watch list. He was on the list. He's moved up the list. How far up? Amelia thought about the surveillance tasking requests, closed without execution. She thought about the anomaly report Harrison had flagged 3 weeks ago, reviewed and cleared. She thought about the name Harrison had given and the way one of the colonels in the room had gone very still when he heard it. Far enough that I want to know where he is before I walk in to Caldwell's office at 1400, she said. Farrell didn't hesitate. I'll have confirmation to you within the hour. Anything else? The 240 on the ground element, they've been told it's a planning hold. I'd like to keep it at that for now. Agreed. They don't need to know what almost happened. Not yet. Not yet, Farrell echoed. Good work, Commander. Watch your back in that building. The line disconnected. Amelia sat with the handset for a moment after the call ended. Watch your back in that building. It was the kind of thing Farrell said when she had specific reasons, not as a general precaution, which meant Farrell knew something she hadn't said on the call and had chosen not to say it on the call, which meant the call itself wasn't fully secure or Farrell wasn't certain yet what she knew. Both possibilities were uncomfortable. She filed them and stood up. She had 90 minutes before Caldwell's office. She used the first 20 to go back through her documentation one more time, not because she doubted it, but because the meeting this afternoon was going to be different from this morning's briefing in ways she needed to be prepared for. This morning, she had been making a case against an operation. This afternoon, she would be making a case for a counterintelligence investigation that pointed toward people inside this building. That was a different kind of argument with different kinds of resistance. She organized her documentation into 3 sections. The first was the source routing, traced the technical foundation of everything else, the cleanest and most irrefutable part of what she had built. The second was the surveillance tasking anomaly, the 3 requests closed without execution, with the access logs showing who had the authority and the timestamp data showing when the closures occurred. The third was the intercept metadata, the collection platform inconsistency, the geographic mismatch, and the point in the processing stream where the attribution had been altered. 3 separate acts, 3 separate points of access, all of them requiring the same specific knowledge of the system, all of them pointing in the same direction. She was reading through the 3rd section for the 4th time when her phone vibrated. A text from a number she recognized as Farrell's secondary line. 2 words and a building designation. Hargrove. Basement. She stared at that for a moment. The basement of the main command building at Fort Adams housed, among other things, the communications infrastructure for the installation, the servers, the routing equipment, the secure lines that everything else depended on. It was not a place that a liaison colonel had routine business. It was, however, a place where someone who needed to do something to the communications architecture of the installation without being observed might go if they had the access and the timing and the belief that nobody was watching. She checked her watch. 12:51, she had a choice. She could go directly to Caldwell's office and report what Farrell had sent her, or she could move. She moved. The basement level required a separate badge read at the stairwell door. Her credentials cleared it. She went down, and the sound of the corridor above disappeared and was replaced by the low continuous hum of equipment and the cooler, drier air that server infrastructure required to function. She did not run. Running attracted attention. She moved with the purposeful pace of someone who had a destination and knew exactly where it was, which was useful to project even when you were not entirely certain what you would find when you arrived. The communications infrastructure room was at the far end of the basement corridor. The door had a keypad and a badge reader. As she came within 20 feet of it, she heard voices from inside, one voice actually, and then a second, and a sound that wasn't quite words. She stopped. The door was not fully closed. She was very still for 2 seconds, listening, placing what she was hearing. One voice was tense and controlled, and she did not recognize it yet. The other voice was raised and familiar. It was Harrison. She pushed the door open. Harrison was backed against a server rack, his laptop clutched to his chest like a shield, his glasses knocked sideways on his face. Standing less than 2 feet from him was a man in Colonel's uniform, late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the carefully maintained physical presence of someone who used size as a management tool. Colonel Dennis Hargrove. He turned when she entered. His face did the thing faces did when a calculation shifted mid-step, a flash of something unguarded, rapidly covered. What replaced it was a version of controlled authority, the expression of a superior officer who has been interrupted in the middle of something he intends to characterize as routine. "Commander," he said. Steady. Almost bored. "This area is restricted. I have clearance," she said. She looked at Harrison. "Are you all right?" Harrison's jaw was tight. He wanted the laptop. "I asked for the laptop," Hargrove corrected smoothly. "Mr. Harrison has been compiling files related to an anomaly report that falls under my purview as that anomaly report is part of an active counterintelligence review," Amelia said. Her voice was flat and even and very clear. "Anything connected to it is under a preservation order as of this morning. Requesting possession of those files is a violation of that order." Hargrove looked at her with the particular expression of a man deciding how hard to push something. "Commander Voss." He said her name the way people said names when they were trying to establish how much they already knew about you. "I'm aware of your presentation this morning. I'm aware of the stand down. What I'm not aware of is any counterintelligence review that has been formally authorized, because I would have been informed. The authorization is above your information tier," she said. The room went very quiet, just the hum of the servers. Hargrove's face changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious to someone who wasn't watching for it. But she was watching for it, had been watching for it, since the moment she walked through the door, and what she saw was the particular micro-expression of a person who has just calculated the distance between where they are and where they thought they were, and found it to be much larger than expected. "Above my information tier," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at the laptop in Harrison's arms. He looked at the door behind her. He looked at her face. And then he did something she had not predicted, which was always the dangerous moment, the moment when a person who is prepared for one set of contingencies encounters a reality their preparation didn't cover. He reached for his radio. She moved before the thought was fully formed. Not toward him, toward the server rack to her left, where the communications routing panel was mounted at eye level. She had studied the Fort Adams infrastructure diagram 2 days ago as part of the installation security review, which meant she knew exactly which panel controlled the internal communications relay for this section of the building. She pulled the manual override. The radio in Hargrove's hand produced a flat. He stared at it, then at her. "Sit down, Colonel," she said. He didn't move. "I'm going to say it once more. Sit down." Something in the way she said it, not louder, not harder, just with the particular quality of a person who has been in situations where someone did not sit down and has a very clear memory of how those situations ended, made him move. He took 2 steps backward and sat on the edge of a server housing, his hands in his lap, his radio useless, his face doing the careful work of a man trying to decide what he still had left to play. Harrison exhaled. His hands were shaking slightly. He was a civilian analyst in his mid-40s, who had spent his career in secure rooms doing careful technical work, and nothing in his career had included anything like the past 4 minutes. "You flagged the anomaly 3 weeks ago," Amelia said to him. He reviewed it and cleared it. "Yes." Harrison's voice was steadier than his hands. "He told me the inconsistencies had been investigated and were within acceptable parameters. He told me to close the flag and move on." "And you closed it." "I closed it." A pause. "I shouldn't have closed it." "You followed the process," she said, which was true and wasn't entirely comfort, but was true. She looked at Hargrove. The surveillance tasking requests, the 3 collection passes that were closed without execution. You had authority to close tasking requests at that level. Hargrove said nothing. "The access logs will show it," she said. "The counterintelligence team will pull them in the next 2 hours. They'll also pull your badge history for this building, including the basement level. And they'll pull the Fusion Center access records going back 18 months, which will show when the second source marker was introduced and which authentication credentials were used to do it." Still nothing. "What I'm trying to determine," she said, "is whether this ends with you in handcuffs, in this basement, or in General Caldwell's office, with counsel present and a chance to give us something useful before the counterintelligence team has finished building their case. Without your cooperation." Hargrove looked at her. His expression was entirely still now, not controlled. Exactly, but emptied out, as if the performance he had been running for, however long he had been running it, had simply stopped, and what was underneath was a face she didn't know yet. "You're 28 years old," he said. "Yes." "How long have you been working this?" She knew what he meant. Not the 6 days she had spent in the building. The thing beneath that. The original lead that had brought her to Fort Adams, that had put her in that corner seat at that briefing, that had given her 6 days to read the file that everyone else had read without seeing what was in it. "Long enough," she said. He nodded, very slowly, as if he was coming to terms with a calculation that had been wrong somewhere, and was only now identifying where the error had been made. "I want counsel," he said. "That's your right. And I want to be in Caldwell's office. Not here. I'll arrange it." She looked at Harrison. "I need you to hold that laptop and not let it out of your physical possession until I tell you otherwise. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. "Immediately. No hesitation." "Good." She moved to the communications panel and restored the relay. She took out her phone and sent a text to the number Farrell had used. 3 words: basement. Bring transport. Then she looked at Hargrove one more time. He was sitting on the edge of the server housing with his hands in his lap and his useless radio beside him, in the particular expression of a person at the end of something, not the end of a mission or a career or a plan, but the end of a particular story they had been telling themselves, which was always the hardest ending of all. She almost felt something for him. Not sympathy exactly. Something more clinical and more complicated. She had been in the military long enough to understand the architecture of the thing that turned a person like Hargrove into what he had apparently become: the grievances, real or manufactured, the access that became temptation, the first small act that committed you to the second, and the second to the third, until the distance back was so large it no longer felt like a distance worth measuring. She didn't feel sympathy, but she felt the weight of it, which was different. 40 seconds later, footsteps in the corridor. 2 people she recognized from Farrell's position team entered the room. They assessed the situation in the way people trained for it, assessed situation completely, immediately, without commentary. One of them looked at her. She looked at Hargrove. "Colonel Hargrove has agreed to proceed to General Caldwell's office with counsel," she said. They moved without ceremony. Professional, quiet, nothing that would draw attention in a corridor. Hargrove stood. He straightened his uniform reflexively, the gesture of someone whose physical bearing had been a source of authority and identity for so long that even now, in this, the body remembered it. He walked out between them without speaking. Harrison watched him go. Then he looked at Amelia. Is it over? This part of it, she said. What's the next part? She picked up her folder from where she had set it on the server rack when she came through the door. She checked her watch. 13:42. 18 minutes to Caldwell's office. The next part, she said, is where we figure out who Hargrove was working for. Harrison's face did something complicated. He had been a technical analyst for 22 years. He understood systems and data and the elegant internal logic of intelligence architecture. He was less comfortable, she could see, with the idea that the corruption of that architecture had a human origin, a person, or more than one person, with a specific purpose and specific beneficiaries. He wasn't doing this alone, Harrison said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly not. Then the compound, the false target someone was going to be waiting when our soldiers arrived. Yes, he absorbed that. She could see him building the picture from the inside out, the way an analyst did, starting from the data structure and working toward the meaning. She could see the moment he arrived at the meaning because his face changed in the specific way faces changed when something abstract became concrete and the concrete thing was genuinely terrible. 240 people, he said. Yes, we came that close. 18 minutes of briefing time, she said. That's how close. He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed his laptop carefully, with both hands, the way you handled something that mattered, and straightened up and looked at her with an expression that had moved past the shock and into something more resolved. What do you need from me in that meeting? He said. She told him. They left the basement together. In the elevator, Harrison pushed his glasses up and said nothing, and Amelia stood with her folder under her arm and thought about Hargrove sitting in an office somewhere in this building with two people from Farrell's team and whatever version of his story he had already begun constructing. She thought about the name he would eventually give them. She didn't know whose name it would be. She had suspects the shape of the operation implied certain kinds of access sets, certain kinds of motivation, certain geographic and institutional connections that narrowed the field. But she didn't know yet. What she knew was that the stand-down had held. The 240 were safe, at least for now. The evidence was preserved. Hargrove was contained. And in 16 minutes, she would walk into Caldwell's office with everything she had built and the testimony of a Daya civilian who had flagged anomalies 3 weeks ago and been told to close them. The elevator reached the main floor. The doors opened. She walked out into the corridor, past the portraits of generals with hard eyes and precise postures, and toward whatever came next. Behind her, Harrison kept pace and said nothing, and the installation moved around them with the ordinary urgency of a place that did serious things and did not stop doing them, even when the serious things went wrong. Somewhere in this building, in a room she hadn't been to yet, General Everett Caldwell was sitting at his desk with the particular silence of a man who had ordered a woman arrested and then discovered, in the space of an hour, that she had been right about everything. She wondered what that felt like. She thought she probably already knew. Caldwell's office smelled like old coffee in consequence. It was 1403 minutes when Amelia walked through the door, which meant she was 3 minutes late, which was the first time in 4 years she had been late to anything that mattered. She had spent those 3 minutes in the corridor outside, giving Harrison a final set of instructions about the sequence in which he should present his documentation, and she did not regret the 3 minutes. But she noted Caldwell's expression when she entered the particular compression around his eyes that told her he had spent the last 3 minutes deciding whether the lateness was deliberate. It was not deliberate, but she didn't correct his assumption. A general who thought she was making a point was more attentive than a general who thought she was disorganized. The office was full. Caldwell behind his desk, hands flat on the surface in front of him, the same posture he had used at the command table, she noted, as if the flat hands were a deliberate physical statement about containment. Colonel Webb to his right, with a tablet and a legal pad covered in handwriting. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez near the far wall, standing rather than sitting, which was a choice. Harrison had come in behind Amelia and taken a seat near the door. Two people she did not know, civilian clothes, specific bearing, the quality of stillness that meant they were from somewhere with 3 letters in its name, occupied chairs along the left side of the room. No Hargrove. She clocked the empty chair where he might have sat and looked at Caldwell. Colonel Hargrove has been taken to a secure interview facility. Caldwell said before she could ask. His voice was careful, not warm. Not cold either, careful, which was something different from both and more deliberate than either. That was arranged approximately 40 minutes ago. I know, she said. I arranged it. Something moved through the room. Not quite surprised that two people from the three-letter agency showed nothing, and Webb was too experienced to show surprise easily. But Vasquez shifted her weight, and Harrison looked down at his laptop, and Caldwell's flat hands pressed slightly harder against the desk surface. You arranged it, he repeated. Yes, sir. When I located him in the basement communications room, I contacted my support team and requested transport to a secure facility pending the counterintelligence review. He came voluntarily. A pause. He asked for counsel and a controlled environment. I provided both. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the arithmetic of the last several hours, the arrest order, the Trident, the stand down, the documentation, and now this. A colonel from his own installation being transported to a secure facility at the arrangement of the 28-year-old commander he had tried to have put in handcuffs before lunch. Sit down, Commander, he said finally. She sat. One of the two civilians, the one on the left, maybe 40, with the particular unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent a career being forgettable on purpose, leaned forward slightly. Commander Voss, I'm going to need you to walk us through the basement encounter in detail. Everything, Hargrove said. Every movement. The sequence exactly as it happened. Before I do that, she said, I need to know who I'm speaking with. The man looked at Caldwell. Caldwell gave the smallest of nods. Dia Counterintelligence, the man said. My colleague is NSA liaison. We were activated this morning after the stand down. She looked at his colleague, who said nothing, and did not change expression, which was confirmation enough. All right, she said. And she told him. She was precise and chronological and did not editorialize. The sequence, the dialogue, the moment Hargrove reached for his radio, the communications override his request for counsel. She watched both civilians absorb it with the particular quality of attention that was neither belief nor disbelief, but pure data collection. They were recording the account, and they would spend a long time with it afterward, pulling it apart at the joints to see what held and what didn't. When she finished, the NSA liaison spoke for the first time. A woman, late 30s, with a voice that was quiet and very precise. The laptop Harrison was carrying. The anomaly files. In his possession. He was instructed not to release it. We'll need it. He knows. She looked at Harrison. He nodded and slid the laptop across the table without being asked again. The NSA liaison took it with both hands and set it in front of her and did not open it, which meant she already knew what was on it or had a specific protocol for how it was going to be accessed. Amelia noted that. Webb spoke. The access logs for the Fusion Center node. We pulled them 40 minutes ago. He set his tablet on the desk and turned it to face the room. The second source marker was introduced 14 months and 11 days ago. The authentication credentials used belonged to Colonel Hargrove. The room processed that. That's direct, Vasquez said. It's about as direct as it gets, Webb said. He did not sound satisfied. He sounded like a man who had spent 8 months building an operation on a foundation that someone had deliberately poisoned and was still coming to terms with exactly how completely he had been used. The credentials are his. The timestamp is his. The only question is whether someone else used his credentials or whether he did it himself. He did it himself, Amelia said. Everyone looked at her. In the basement, before his radio stopped working, he made one statement that wasn't denial. He said the anomaly report Harrison flagged 3 weeks ago fell under his purview. He used the word purview. He was telling me he considered it his territory to manage. That's not the language of someone who's been framed. That's the language of someone who's been maintaining control of a process they consider theirs. The DIA counterintelligence officer wrote something on his notepad. Did he say anything that indicated who he was working with? No, but he asked me how long I'd been working this. Not the 6 days in the building. He meant something longer. He understood that the investigation that put me in that room started before Fort Adams. Did he seem surprised that it had? She thought about Hargrove's face in the basement, the micro-expression she had caught in the first 2 seconds, the rapid recalibration. No, she said. He seemed surprised that it had caught up with him here, not surprised that it existed. The counterintelligence officer and the NSA liaison exchanged a look that lasted less than a second and communicated something she wasn't in the room for. She let it go for now. Caldwell had been quiet through all of this. She was aware of him in the way she was always aware of the senior person in a room, not with primary attention but with peripheral tracking, catching his micro-responses, the quality of his silence, the moments when his hands moved, and the moments when they stayed flat. He was struggling. Not with the facts she thought he had accepted, the facts somewhere between the command center and now. He was struggling with something more structural than facts. He was struggling with the shape of what the facts implied about the institution he had given his life to, about the people he had promoted and trusted and defended, about the systems he had relied on and championed, about the certainty he had carried into the command center at 0930 that morning, like a uniform he had been wearing. So long he'd forgotten it was a uniform. She understood that struggle. It was not a small thing to understand that you had been inside a corrupted system and had not seen the corruption. It was especially not a small thing for a person who had built an identity around the ability to see clearly. At 1447, her phone vibrated. She glanced at it under the desk edge. Farrell. A single line. Hargrove gave a name. You're going to want to sit down. She was already sitting down. She typed back name. The response took 40 seconds. The longest 40 seconds of the afternoon. Then it came. She read it twice. She looked up at Caldwell. General, she said, I need everyone in this room to understand that what I'm about to say changes the scope of this investigation significantly. The room went still. I've just received confirmation from my commanding officer that Colonel Hargrove has given a name in his interview. The person who directed the target patch manipulation. The person who had the operational reason to want this mission to execute against that compound. Caldwell's hands came off the desk surface for the first time. Who? She said the name. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Webb's tablet slipped from his fingers and hit the table with a crack that made Harrison flinch. Vasquez, who had maintained the composed stillness of someone trained to absorb bad news, turned her face toward the wall and stayed like that for 3 full seconds before she turned back. The counterintelligence officer stopped writing mid-letter. The NSA liaison looked at Amelia with an expression that was not surprised she had known, or had suspected, or had been told to prepare for this, but which was something close to grave, the expression of someone watching a very thing become officially real. Caldwell stared at her. Say that again, he said. His voice had changed. Something fundamental in it had changed. Something she had not heard change in a voice in a long time. Something that was not weakness, but was the thing that happened to the voices of genuinely strong people when the world they understood rearranged itself around them without warning. She said the name again. He closed his eyes just for a moment, just long enough for her to see that behind the 4 stars and the 40 years and the absolute certainty, there was a person who had trusted someone he should not have trusted and who would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life in the specific painful way you carried things that could not be undone. Then he opened them. Tell me everything, he said. So she did. The name Hargrove had given was Brigadier General Arthur Klein, Pentagon liaison to the Regional Intelligence Fusion Architecture, the person who had been the primary advocate for the target package within the institutional hierarchy above Fort Adams. The person whose recommendation had accelerated the mission timeline from a notional 6-month planning horizon to the 72-hour execution window that was now on hold. Klein had not entered Amelia's watch list through the same access trail analysis that had surfaced Hargrove. He had entered it through a different thread, entirely one she had begun pulling 3 weeks before her arrival at Fort Adams, when a pattern in the procurement records for a specific regional contractor had caught her attention. The contractor supplied logistics support to coalition operations in the area of the false target. The contractor had significant financial exposure to the outcome of American military operations in that region. The contractor had, over the preceding 14 months, paid approximately $2.3 million in consulting fees to a shell entity incorporated in Delaware. The shell entity's registered agent was a law firm. The law firm had represented, among other clients, a trust that named Arthur Klein's wife as beneficiary. It was not a clean chain. There were 3 organizational layers between Klein's family trust and the Delaware shell, and any competent defense attorney would spend the next 2 years arguing about each of them. But it was a chain, and Amelia had built it with documentation. And Hargrove's identification of Klein as the operational director of the target package manipulation was the piece that made the chain into something a prosecutor could actually use. The compound, she explained to the room, was not an enemy logistics hub. The compound was an archive. Specifically, it was a location where documentation of the contractor's activities in the region, financial records, communication logs, records of payments that connected the contractor to both Klein and to a network of local intermediaries who had been skimming coalition's funds for the better part of 3 years, had been consolidated and secured by a coalition partner agency that was preparing to hand it to an international oversight body. The mission was not designed to neutralize a threat. It was designed to destroy evidence. The 240 soldiers on the ground element would have executed a strike against a compound containing no enemy combatants. They would have destroyed the archive. They might have triggered a response from the coalition partner security personnel protecting the site, which would have meant American soldiers in a lethal engagement with Allied forces over an evidence cache that nobody in the operational chain was supposed to know existed. And when it was over, the paper trail that connected Arthur Klein to $2.3 million in suspect consulting fees would have burned with everything else. The room sat with that for a long time. It was Webb who finally spoke, and his voice had something in it that she had not heard from him before, something raw and close to the surface that all the professional training in the world couldn't completely smooth over. He used us, he said. He used this command, this installation, 240 soldiers, and 8 months of operational planning as a tool to destroy evidence against himself. Yes, she said, these are American soldiers. Webb's voice cracked slightly on the last word, and he pressed his mouth together and looked at the table for a moment. People with families. People who trusted the intelligence they were given. Yes, she said again. Because there wasn't anything else to say that was adequate, and she had learned a long time ago that the inadequacy of language in moments like this was not a failure of the language, it was an accurate reflection of what the thing actually cost. Vasquez turned back from the wall. Her face was entirely composed now, in the deliberate way of someone who has done the internal work very quickly and is ready to operate again. Where is Klein right now? The counterintelligence officer answered before Amelia could. Pentagon. In a meeting that we arranged to keep him in place as of 90 minutes ago. He looked at Amelia with something that was close to respect and not quite there yet. We had him on our radar. We didn't have Hargrove's direct identification yet. We were about 6 hours behind you. The procurement records, she said. The procurement records. He nodded. We found the same we couldn't close it without a witness who could place Klein as the operational director. Now you have one. Now we have one. He capped his pen. Uncapped it. Capped it again. Commander, I'm going to need to ask you something directly. Go ahead. The original lead that brought you to Fort Adams. The procurement pattern you identified. How long have you been developing this? She had known this question was coming since the basement when Hargrove had asked her the same thing in different words. She had given Hargrove a non-answer. The DI counterintelligence officer deserved more than that. 7 months, she said. The room recalibrated. 7 months was not a review assignment. 7 months was an investigation. Who authorized the investigation, he asked. My commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command, with oversight from the Inspector General's office. And the assignment here, the intelligence review, was the access mechanism. The review assignment was genuine. The intelligence review needed to happen. But it also gave me 6 days inside the target package with authorized access and a plausible reason to be asking the questions I needed to ask. Caldwell's jaw had tightened. She could see him working through the implications of what she had just said, the fact that his installation had been the subject of an investigation whose existence he had not known about, that the officer he had tried to arrest had been operating under a counterintelligence mandate above his visibility tier for 7 months, that the meeting he had run this morning had been, in a very specific sense, the culmination of someone else's operation running parallel to his own. General, she said, because she owed him this directly, you were not under investigation. Fort Adams was not under investigation. The target of the investigation was the intelligence architecture above this command, specifically the manipulation of the target package and the people responsible for it. The decision to run the investigation through this installation was made because this installation was the execution point, the place where the manipulation would become visible if anyone looked carefully enough. He looked at her, and nobody else looked carefully enough. The staff review team was looking for confirmation that the package was valid. I was looking for evidence that it had been compromised. Those are different investigations with different methodologies and different results. You came in looking for the corruption. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment. Then how certain were you that you'd find it? It was the most human question he had asked her all day. Not a general's question, a person's question. The question of someone who wanted to understand how another person's mind worked in the space between certainty and risk. 80%, she said. When I walked in this morning, I was 80% certain that what I had found in the preliminary review was manipulation and not error. The other 20% was the possibility that I was seeing a pattern that wasn't there, that the anomalies were genuine anomalies and not constructed ones. And now, 100%, she said. Now I'm at 100%. Another silence. Different from the silences earlier in the day, not the silence of resistance or confrontation or calculation, but something that felt closer to the silence that came after something was over, when the weight of what had almost happened settled onto everyone in the room at the same time. It was 15:22 when the counterintelligence officer's phone rang. He answered it, listened for less than 10 seconds, said 2 words and ended the call. He looked at the room. Klein has been taken into custody at the Pentagon. A pause. He asked to speak with his attorney. And then, before the attorney arrived, he asked to speak with whoever was running the field side of the investigation. Everyone in the room looked at Amelia. She felt it, the weight of those looks, the collective decision of the room about where this was supposed to go next. She had felt that weight before, in different rooms, under different circumstances, and she had learned that the only useful response to it was to accept it without either dramatizing it or deflecting it. I'll speak with him, she said. The counterintelligence officer shook his head. That's not standard protocol. The field officer doesn't typically. He asked for whoever was running the field side, she said. If I don't go, he'll know we're following protocol, and he'll know protocol means his attorney controls the next 12 hours. Right now, he's in a room alone with the understanding that the person who built this case is willing to talk to him. That's leverage. I'd like to use it before his attorney walks through the door. The officer looked at his NSA colleague. She gave that single-second look again. Whatever it communicated, it was enough. You have 40 minutes, he said. She stood. She picked up her folder. She looked at Caldwell. He stood as well. Commander Voss. He said her name the way he hadn't said it at any point during the day, without the careful distance, without the assessment, without the calculation of what she was and what authority she carried and whether it was enough to override his own. He said it the way you said the name of a person you had misjudged at considerable cost and were not yet sure how to address that, except to address it directly. I owe you an apology, he said. The room went very still. The arrest order, he said. In the command center. In front of my officers. That was he stopped. Started again. I had 40 years of certainty in that room this morning. You came in and told me the certainty was wrong, and I responded to being wrong by trying to remove the person who was right. He met her eyes. That's not command, that's ego. I know the difference, and I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. General Everett Caldwell, 4 stars, 40 years, the particular posture of a person who had never said those words in a command context before and had just said them in front of 7 witnesses. Thank you, sir, she said. And she meant it not warmly, not dramatically, but with the genuine weight of someone who understood how much it had cost him. She walked out. The corridor was the same corridor it had been all day, but she moved through it differently now. Not faster, she never moved faster than the situation warranted, but with the particular quality of focus that came when everything prior was resolved, and the only thing that existed was what was directly ahead. A car was waiting to take her to the secure facility where Klein was being held. She got in and spent the 12-minute drive, not reviewing her documentation, she had reviewed it enough, but sitting with the quiet, thinking about nothing tactical, thinking about the mountainside she had been on in a country she had never officially visited, about the 7 operators who came home, about the particular weight of knowing things that nobody writes down. Arthur Klein had been moving pieces on a board for 14 months. He had used Hargrove's access and his own institutional authority and a contractor's financial desperation to construct a machine that would have killed the truth about what he had taken and who had helped him take it. He had built the machine carefully, intelligently, with a genuine understanding of how the systems around him worked. And then a 28-year-old commander had sat in a corner of a command room for 6 days and read a file 4 times, and the machine had stopped. She was not proud of that in the way people expected her to be proud of things. She had never been comfortable with the kind of pride that announced itself, but she carried it quietly, the way she carried everything as the knowledge that the work had been done and done correctly, and the outcome had been the right one. The car stopped. She got out. The facility was an unremarkable building, low, institutional, the particular neutrality of a place designed to contain rather than impress. 2 security checks to get through the entrance, both of which her credentials cleared immediately. Inside a third-floor room, 2 chairs. A man in his late 50s with the physical bearing of someone who had spent a long career inside power and was only now discovering that the inside of power and the inside of consequence were not the same place. Brigadier General Arthur Klein. He looked at her when she entered. She had expected several possible expressions: defiance, contempt, calculation, the particular blankness of someone who had decided to feel nothing. She had not expected what she actually saw, which was recognition. Not of her specifically, they had never met, but recognition of the type of thing she represented, the thing he had built his entire mechanism specifically to prevent from reaching him. "You're young," he said. "That keeps coming up," she said. She sat down across from him. He studied her face. "How long?" "7 months," she said. Same answer she had given in Caldwell's office. It seemed to be the answer people needed. He absorbed it. The procurement records. The procurement records, she confirmed. He exhaled. A long, slow breath. That was not defeat exactly. People like him did not go to defeat in a single breath, but was something adjacent to it. The breath of a person letting go of a version of the story they had been holding on to. "My attorney will be here in 30 minutes, he said. "I know, so you have 30 minutes. "I have 30 minutes, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he put his hands flat on the table, same gesture as Caldwell. She noticed the flat hands, the contained position. Something about power and tables, apparently. "What do you want to know?" he said. She looked at him steadily. Outside this room, the investigation would continue for months. The evidence chain would be built and rebuilt, examined by prosecutors and defense attorneys and oversight committees. Hargrove would cooperate or not cooperate. The contractor would be subpoenaed and audited. The paper trail between the Delaware Shell and Klein's family trust would be traced and documented in the specific, painstaking way that financial crimes were traced and documented. All of that would happen. All of that was already in motion. What she wanted to know was not for the investigation. It was for herself. "The soldiers," she said. "The 240. Did you think about them? When you built this, did you think about what would happen to them when they reached that compound?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought about it," he said. And another silence. Longer. The silence of a man sitting inside a question he did not have a clean answer to, not because he didn't know the answer, but because knowing it and saying it aloud were 2 entirely different exposures. "I told myself the operation was low risk," he said, "that the compound was undefended, that they'd execute and extract without significant contact." "You told yourself?" "Yes," meaning you weren't certain. He looked at the table. "No," he said, "I wasn't certain." She sat with that for a moment. Not with anger. She had moved past anger sometime in the basement when she had looked at Hargrove on the edge of the server housing and felt the complicated weight of what turned people into this. She sat with it the way she sat with most difficult things, steadily, without looking away. "All right," she said. "Then let's start at the beginning," and he did. Klein talked for 26 minutes before his attorney arrived. In those 26 minutes, he gave her more than she had expected and less than she needed, which was about what she had calculated going in. People like Arthur Klein did not confess, not in the complete way that prosecutors dreamed about, and defense attorneys spent their careers preventing. They negotiated. They offered fragments. They gave you enough to demonstrate cooperation without giving you enough to make cooperation unnecessary. It was a rational strategy, and she did not fault him for it. And she extracted everything she could, the fragments, before the attorney walked through the door, and the conversation became a very different kind of conversation. What he gave her was the architecture. Not the specifics, not the account numbers, not the names of every intermediary, not the precise sequence of payments between the contractor and the Delaware Shell and the trust that had benefited Klein's family. Those would come later, through subpoenas and forensic accounting and the particular grinding patience of federal prosecution. What he gave her was the shape of how it had worked and, more importantly, why it had started. It had started, he said, with a contract that was already corrupt before he arrived at it. The regional logistics contractor, a company called Meridian Solutions Group, incorporated in Virginia, operating primarily in the coalition support zone, had been skimming from coalition supply contracts for approximately 3 years before Klein became aware of it. The skimming was not subtle. It was the ordinary kind of institutional corruption that grew in environments where oversight was thin, and the people responsible for oversight were either overwhelmed or looking elsewhere. Inflated invoices, services billed but not rendered, materials purchased at significant markups through subsidiaries that the contractor effectively controlled. Klein had not discovered it through an investigation. He had discovered it because Meridian's principal owner had approached him directly at a conference in Brussels 14 months ago, explained that certain oversight documentation was being compiled by a coalition partner agency, and offered him a choice. He told me the documentation would name me, Klein said. His voice was flat, in the way that voices went flat when people were narrating the worst decision of their lives. He said there were audit trails in the contractor records that implicated my office in approving inflated contracts. He said if the documentation reached the oversight body, I would be investigated. Were the audit trails real? Amelia asked. A pause, some of them. She let that some of them. Which meant that Klein's exposure had been real, not manufactured by Meridian as pure leverage, but genuine vulnerability, genuine complicity at some level, and Meridian had known about it and had come to him not as a co-conspirator recruiting a partner, but as a predator finding an already wounded target. So the choice he offered you, she said, help bury the documentation or be named in it. Klein's hands were still flat on the table. He was very calm about it, very businesslike. He laid it out like a contract negotiation, and the consulting fees were his idea. He said it would look worse if I helped him for nothing. The cooperation without compensation was harder to explain than a documented business relationship that could be framed as legitimate. It was, she thought, a genuinely sophisticated piece of corruption architecture. The payments made Klein look like a knowing co-conspirator rather than a coerced one, which deepened his exposure and made the threat of exposure more effective, which made him more controllable. He had walked into a trap that had been designed to get tighter the more he struggled. She did not say this to him. He already knew it. The compound, she said. The archive location, how did you get it? Meridian had a source inside the coalition partner agency. Someone who knew where the documentation was being consolidated and secured. When the decision was made to destroy it, Meridian provided the location, and Hargrove built the target package around it. Hargrove managed the intelligence architecture. I gave him the location and the operational objective. He built the mechanism to get your military to do the work. Your military. The phrase registered. She filed it. How many people inside this building knew what the real target was? He met her eyes. One, he said. Just Hargrove. She studied his face for the particular micro-expression that meant he was protecting someone, the slight tension around the eyes, the quality of stillness that was different from natural stillness. She didn't find it, which either meant he was telling the truth or he was better at this than Hargrove had been. She moved on. The coalition partner agency's security personnel at the compound, she said. You said you told yourself the operation was low risk. How many personnel were protecting the site? A longer pause this time. Meridian estimated 12 to 15. 12 to 15 Allied security personnel protecting an archive facing a ground element of 240 American soldiers operating on falsified intelligence. The outcome of that encounter would not have been ambiguous. It would not have been low risk. It would have been catastrophic, and the catastrophe would have been attributed to a hostile engagement with an enemy network that did not exist, and the archive that explained all of it would have been ash. She had known this since the morning, but hearing him confirm the number made it concrete in a way that the abstract calculation had not been. 12 to 15, she said. Yes. Allied personnel. The attorney walked through the door at that moment. 55, silver-haired, with the particular efficiency of someone who charged by the 6-minute increment and was already calculating how long his client had been talking without him. General Klein. He stopped when he saw Amelia. Who are you? Commander Amelia Voss, she said. She was already standing, already gathering her folder. We were just finishing. The attorney looked at Klein. Klein looked at the table. We'll need a complete record of this conversation, the attorney said. There's no record, she said. Off-the-record conversation at the subject's request. Standard protocol. Which was true, and which was also the reason she had committed every word of the 26 minutes to memory, rather than notes. The attorney's expression said he did not believe the no-record claim and would spend the next several weeks trying to get it thrown out anyway. She didn't care. What she had taken out of that room was not in any document. It was in her head, where it would become the foundation of a prosecution narrative that prosecutors would spend the next 2 years building with the documentation she had already assembled. She looked at Klein one more time. He looked up from the table. His face had changed again. Not empty now, something had moved into the emptiness, something she recognized as the particular kind of exhaustion that came at the end of a long performance. The exhaustion of a person who had been carrying a secret at significant weight for 14 months and had just put it down, even involuntarily, even catastrophically. She nodded at him once. Not warmth, not contempt. Acknowledgement of a human being at the worst moment of his life, which cost her nothing and seemed to cost him something. She walked out. It was 16:41 when she got back into the car. The driver said nothing, which was correct. She sat in the back seat, and for the first time since she had walked into the command center at 09:30 that morning, she let herself be still, not thinking through the next step, not running the trace on the next anomaly. Just still, with the particular quality of someone who has been operating at full intensity for a long time and has arrived temporarily at a moment when full intensity is no longer required. Her phone vibrated. "Farrell," she answered. "I've been briefed," Farrell said. "Both interviews." "All right. The counterintelligence team wants to move on Meridian tonight. They're asking whether you have documentation beyond the procurement records that connects the shell entity to Klein's trust. I have 3 additional financial transfer records that weren't in the primary package. I'll send them within the hour." "Good." A pause. "How are you?" It was not a question Farrell asked often. It was not a question people in their line of work asked often, because the answer was almost always complicated. And the complication was almost always something that couldn't be productively addressed in the field. "I'm fine," she said. "That was a full day." "Yes." The stand down held. "The ground element is intact. Klein is in custody. Hargrove is in custody. The archive is safe." Farrell's voice had the quality of someone reading a list they had been wanting to read for a long time. 7 months of work. "Yes. You should know that the oversight body received a preliminary notification this afternoon. The archive will be transferred to their custody within 48 hours. Everything Meridian spent 14 months trying to destroy is about to become an evidentiary record." Amelia looked out the car window. The installation moved past the wide roads, the functional buildings, the people moving between them with the purposeful urgency of a place that did not stop doing what it did because any particular day had been harder than usual. "Good," she said. She meant it without any drama, which was the only way she knew how to mean things. "Get some sleep, Commander," Farrell said. "Tomorrow is going to be complicated." She ended the call. The car brought her back to the main administrative building. She went inside, found the secure communications room she had used that morning, and spent 40 minutes transmitting the 3 additional financial transfer records to the counterintelligence team with annotation notes explaining how they connected to the primary chain. Clean, precise, no editorializing. When she came out, it was 17:38. Webb was waiting in the corridor. She stopped when she saw him. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, not in the aggressive posture of confrontation, but in the particular posture of someone who has been waiting for a while and has had time to compose whatever they came to say. "Colonel," she said. "Commander." He uncrossed his arms. "I owe you something. You don't." "I do. I ran the validation on that package 3 separate times. I told the general it was clean. I told him every concern you raised had been addressed." He met her eyes directly, which she respected. People who looked away when delivering an uncomfortable honesty were delivering it primarily for their own benefit. "I missed it. You were running a confirmation review," she said. "You were checking whether the package was consistent with itself. It was consistent with itself. The manipulation was upstream of everything you could see. That's generous. It's accurate." He was quiet for a moment. "The surveillance tasking requests. The 3 collection passes that were closed. I signed off on the administrative closures. Hargrove brought them to me as routine maintenance. Said the collection windows had passed. I signed them." She had known this. It had been in the access logs. Webb's signature below Hargrove's authorization on each of the 3 closures. She had noted it and moved on because the logs showed clearly that the closures had been initiated and framed by Hargrove and that Webb's role had been procedural countersignature, the kind of administrative processing that happened dozens of times a week in a command his size. You countersign routine administrative closures that were presented to you by an authorized superior, she said. That's not culpability. That's process. It's also how this kind of thing survives, he said, because it fits into the process. Because everyone is doing their job exactly correctly, and nobody sees the thing underneath the job. He looked at her with something that was not quite guilt and not quite determination, but was somewhere between them, the expression of someone deciding what to do with a lesson that had cost a significant amount to learn. How do you not miss it? How did you walk in and see in 6 days what 3 review cycles didn't catch in 3 weeks? She thought about how to answer that honestly. I wasn't trying to confirm the package, she said. I was trying to break it. There's a difference between those two investigations. When you're confirming, you're looking for reasons to trust what's in front of you. When you're trying to break something, you're looking for reasons not to. The package was built to survive confirmation review. It wasn't built to survive someone who came in specifically looking for the seam. Webb absorbed that. We should build that into our process. A designated break-it review, independent of the confirmation chain. Yes, she said. You should. He looked at her for another moment. Are you going to be all right? He stopped, reconsidered. That was a significant day for a person to have. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. I've had significant days before, I don't doubt it. He straightened up, moved away from the wall. For what it's worth, and I understand if it's worth exactly nothing, when I'm glad you were in that room. So am I, she said. He nodded and walked away down the corridor, and she stood for a moment looking after him, thinking about what he had said about process, about the designated break-it review, about the structural gap that had made all of this possible, not the corruption, which required human choice and human failure, but the gap in institutional architecture that had let the corruption be invisible for 14 months. She made a note, not in her folder in the notebook she kept separate from her operational documentation, the one where she put the things that weren't evidence, but were observations. The things that would eventually become something other than observations if she was patient enough with them. She had been patient for 7 months. She could be patient for a little longer. She was walking toward the exit when General Caldwell appeared from a side corridor. She was not certain whether the appearance was deliberate, whether he had been watching for her, or whether it was coincidence, the kind of timing that happened in buildings where many people were moving through many corridors on many urgent errands and occasionally arrived at the same intersection at the same moment. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other in the corridor, and something happened that was different from every version of looking at each other they had done throughout the day. In the command center, it had been confrontation. In his office, it had been negotiation. Now it was simply 2 people in a corridor at the end of a long day that had changed a significant number of things. I've been briefed on the Klein interview, he said. I sent the additional financial records to the counterintelligence team an hour ago. I know. They informed me, he paused. 12 to 15 coalition personnel at the compound. Yes, he said nothing for a moment. She could see him doing the same thing Webb had done, the same thing Harrison had done, the same thing Vasquez had done, constructing the concrete reality of what had almost happened from the abstract numbers of what had been prevented. 240 American soldiers, 12 to 15 Allied personnel, a compound full of evidence that would have burned, a network of corruption that would have survived. I've been in command for 17 years, he said. I've ordered operations in a dozen countries. He stopped. I've been wrong before about tactics, about timing, about resources. Those things happen in command. You accept them and you learn from them. Another pause, longer. I have never been wrong about the fundamental nature of what I was asking people to do. I have never ordered an operation that was something other than what I understood it to be. You didn't order this one either, she said. The operation was stood down. Because of you. Because the evidence was there to find and I found it. He looked at her with the expression she had seen in his office, the one that still had the shape of authority, but something human had come through it, the way weather came through a structure you thought was sealed. Commander, I want to ask you something that I'm going to ask you to answer honestly regardless of rank. All right. When I gave the arrest order this morning, when the MPs were moving towards you, how certain were you that revealing your credentials would work, that it would stop the room? She thought about that moment. The MP's hands, the folder on the table, the jacket coming off. Not completely certain, she said. He hadn't expected that answer. She could see it, you weren't certain. I was certain about the evidence. I was certain that what I had found was real, and that if the right people looked at it carefully, they would reach the same conclusion I had reached. I was not certain that the credentials would override the arrest order in that specific moment. You had already committed to the order publicly. Reversing it required you to decide, in front of your officers, that something you had just done was wrong. She looked at him steadily. That's not a small thing to ask of a person. He was quiet for a moment, but you did it anyway. The alternative was leaving the room, and I couldn't leave the room. Because of the soldiers. Because of the soldiers, she said. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she began to wonder whether there was something else he wanted to say that he hadn't found the shape of yet. Then he said it. I'm going to recommend a formal commendation, he said, for the investigation, for today. I'm going to put my name on that recommendation, and I'm going to make sure it gets to the right people with the full context of what happened. She shook her head. That's not necessary. I know it's not necessary. I'm doing it anyway. His voice had something in it that she recognized from the apology in his office, the particular weight of someone doing the right thing because it was right and not because it was comfortable. You're going to spend the next 20 years in rooms where people look at you and make the same calculation I made this morning. And you're going to be right and they're going to be wrong. And the question is whether the record reflects that or whether the record just shows a visitor badge and a corner seat. She looked at him. The record should reflect it, he said. I'll make sure it does. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, thank you, General. And she meant that too. She walked out of the building at 1819. The October air was cold in the way October air was cold in Virginia, not the killing cold of deep winter, but the particular sharp cold that arrived at the edge of seasons, the cold that reminded you that warmth was a temporary arrangement and that everything eventually came to its edges. She stood outside for a moment before moving toward the transportation pool. She thought about the 240 soldiers in the ground element. They had been told the mission was on hold for logistical reasons. They were frustrated. They were ready, and ready soldiers with no mission were restless in the specific way of people who had oriented their entire nervous systems toward a thing that had then been removed. They would be told more eventually, not the full story. Not the part about Klein and Hargrove and a Delaware shell entity and a contractor skimming coalition funds, but enough to understand that the hold had been necessary and correct. She thought about the coalition partner agency's personnel at the compound. 12 to 15 people who had no idea how close they had come to an encounter with 240 American soldiers following falsified intelligence. They would never know. The archive they were protecting would be transferred to the oversight body within 48 hours, and their job would be done and they would go home. They would never know. She thought about Hargrove in a secure facility somewhere, with his attorney and his cooperation agreement and the particular project of rebuilding a version of himself that could survive what was coming. She thought about Klein in his facility doing the same. She thought about Meridian Solutions Group and its principal owner, who did not yet know that tonight a federal team would begin the process of serving a series of subpoenas that would dismantle his company's finances from the outside in. She thought about Farrell saying, "Get some sleep, Commander." She thought about the notebook in her bag with the note she had made about the break-it review. Her phone vibrated one more time, a number she did not recognize. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then a voice she did not know, male, mid-40s, with an accent she couldn't immediately place. Careful. Controlled. "Commander Voss," the voice said. "I'm told you're the person who stopped the Fort Adams operation today." She said nothing. She waited. "I represent the coalition partner agency whose archive is at the compound," the voice said. "I've been trying to make contact with the American military for 6 weeks about the threat to that archive. I was told twice that my concerns had been reviewed and found to be unsubstantiated. Reviewed and found to be unsubstantiated." She knew exactly who would have reviewed those concerns and exactly what finding them unsubstantiated would have required. "I have documentation," the voice continued, "about Meridian, about the payments, about a second set of transactions that your investigation may not have found yet. Transactions that don't go to Klein's trust. They go somewhere else." She went very still. "Somewhere else," she said. "Yes. How many people are we talking about?" A pause. "At least 3 more. Possibly 5. She looked at the installation behind her. The wide corridors. The portraits of generals. The systems inside systems that she had spent 7 months learning and one day cracking open. "Where are you?" she said. He told her. She turned around and walked back inside. Because this was not over. It was never, she understood now, simply over. The machine that had built itself around Meridian and Klein and Hargrove had not been a small machine. It had been large enough to manipulate intelligence at a federal level, large enough to move a 240-person military operation like a piece on a board, large enough to survive 14 months of institutional oversight without anyone seeing it except a coalition partner official who had been trying to report it for 6 weeks and been told his concerns were unsubstantiated. A machine that large had more than 2 operators, at least 3 more, possibly 5. She was already running the implications as she moved back through the security checkpoint. The procurement records she had built the original case on, she had focused on the Klein connection, on the thread that led to Fort Adams and the false target package. She had known the financial structure was larger than that single thread. She had noted it and moved past it because the immediate priority had been the soldiers. The soldiers were safe. Now she had time for the rest. She found the secure communications room and called Farrell. 2 rings. "I thought I told you to sleep," Farrell said. "I just received a call from a representative of the coalition partner agency." She gave Farrell the number that had called her. "He has documentation of additional transactions. Beyond Klein. He's been trying to report this for 6 weeks and was told twice that his concerns were unsubstantiated." A pause. A long one by Farrell's standards. "How many additional subjects?" He said, "At least 3, possibly 5. Another pause. "How confident are you in the call?" Farrell said, "Could be a provocation. Could be someone who knows the investigation is live and is trying to redirect it." "It could be," she said, "but he knew my name. He knew it was a military operation that was stopped today. He knew it was Fort Adams. None of that has been released, which means his source is inside the investigation, or inside the coalition partner agency, which has legitimate access to some of it." She paused. "I'd like to make contact in person. Verify his documentation directly." And Farrell's voice had the particular quality it got when it was about to say something she wasn't going to enjoy hearing. "You have been operational for 14 hours. You have run a counterintelligence confrontation, a command-level briefing, 2 subject interviews, and a document transmission. At some point, the instrument needs maintenance. After I verify the documentation." A very long silence. 24 hours, Farrell said finally. "You have 24 hours to make contact and verify. Then you stand down for 72 hours minimum, regardless of what you find. Those are not negotiable terms." "Understood." "And Commander." "Ma'am, when I said watch your back in that building this morning, I had 3 names on a preliminary concern list. 2 of them were Hargrove and Klein." A pause. "The 3rd name is someone whose transactions you haven't traced yet." Amelia's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Is the 3rd name on the list of the 5 the contact mentioned?" "I don't know yet," Farrell said. "That's what the next 24 hours are for." The line went quiet. Amelia stood in the secure communications room with the phone in her hand and the weight of the day settling around her, and the new weight of what was coming adding itself to it, the way weight accumulated in this work not all at once, never all at once, but layer by layer, each layer adding to the one before it, until the carrying of it was simply the condition of being who you were. She was good at carrying things. She picked up her folder and walked out into the corridor. The contact's name was Elias Varga, and he was sitting in a secured annex of the Coalition Partner Agency's Regional Liaison Office with a leather briefcase on his lap and the particular expression of a man who had been trying to tell the truth for 6 weeks and had almost given up on anyone listening. Amelia arrived at 1944. She had cleared 3 separate security checkpoints to get to him, each one adding another layer of distance between the outside world and this specific room, this specific man, this specific briefcase. He stood when she entered. He was shorter than she had imagined, from the voice compact, careful moving, with the eyes of someone who processed everything twice before deciding how much of the processing to show. He was 43, she would later learn. He had been a financial intelligence analyst for the Coalition Partner Agency for 16 years. He had filed his first internal report about Meridian Solutions Group 14 months ago, been told it was under review, filed a second report 8 months ago, been told the matter had been investigated and resolved, and had spent the 6 weeks since watching a military operation build toward a target he knew was not what the military thought it was, while every channel he tried to use to stop it produced the same result: reviewed, unsubstantiated, closed. He had found Amelia's name 3 days ago through a thread he would not fully explain, and she did not push him on because the thread led back to Farrell's office and Farrell's pre-positioned team and the specific fact that the investigation that had put Amelia in the Fort Adams command center had been leaving traces in the intelligence architecture that someone careful enough and motivated enough could follow backward to its source. Varga was careful enough and motivated enough. "You stopped it," he said, when she sat down across from him. Not a greeting, a statement. The statement of someone who had been watching a clock run down and had seen it stop at the last possible interval. "The mission is on hold," she said. "Klein and Hargrove are in custody. Meridian is going to be served with federal subpoenas tonight." He exhaled. Something that had been held very tight in his face released slightly, not completely, not in the way of someone whose problem was solved, but in the way of someone whose most immediate fear had been addressed. The thing underneath the immediate fear was still there. "The briefcase," she said. He opened it. What he placed on the table between them was not a single document. It was a portfolio organized, tabbed, the work of someone who had been building a case with the particular discipline of a person who understood that the case might need to stand alone without him if the worst happened. She understood that discipline intimately. She went through the portfolio methodically. He sat across from her and said nothing while she read, which she appreciated. People who narrated their own documentation while you read it were people who didn't fully trust the documentation to speak for itself. Varga trusted his. It spoke clearly. The transactions he had identified were not connected to Klein's family trust. They were connected to 3 separate financial entities in 2 different jurisdictions, and when she traced the structure, she did it in her head, building the map as she read, because she had spent 7 months learning to read financial architecture. The way other people read text, the entities resolved into something she had not expected. Not Pentagon, not DIA, not any of the institutional nodes she had been building the investigation around. 2 of the financial entities connected to a procurement oversight office at a level above the Pentagon. An office whose function was specifically to review and validate the kind of contractor relationships that Meridian had been exploiting. An office that was supposed to be the backstop, the layer of the system that caught exactly what Meridian had been doing. The backstop had been compromised. She looked up from the portfolio. Varga was watching her face. "You see it," he said. "The oversight office," she said. 2 people. Based on the transaction timing and the authorization records I was able to access, 2 people in the oversight office were receiving payments through the second set of shell entities. One of them is the deputy director of the office. She sat with that for a moment. The deputy director of the procurement oversight office. The person whose institutional role was to prevent exactly what Meridian had been doing, who had apparently been receiving payments to ensure that the prevention never happened. "You said at least 3, possibly 5, she said. "The third connection is less direct. A consulting contract between one of the shell entities and a law firm. The law firm has represented the oversight office on 3 separate matters in the past 2 years. The connection might be coincidental." He paused. "I don't think it's coincidental." "Neither do I," she said. She closed the portfolio. She looked at Varga. "You've been carrying this for 6 weeks since you knew about the operation." "Since I learned where the target was," he said. "Before that, I was carrying the financial intelligence for 14 months. And when your reports were closed," he looked at the table for a moment. When he looked up, his face had something in it that was difficult to name, the specific exhaustion of a person who has done the right thing repeatedly and been told repeatedly that the right thing was wrong. "The first time my report was closed, I thought it was a process failure. The second time, I started to understand what I was dealing with." He paused. "When I learned that the target package had cleared full DIA validation and was moving to execution, I understood that the process failure and the corruption were the same thing. That the system I was trying to report through was part of what I was trying to report." She knew that understanding. She had arrived at it herself in a different context. It was one of the hardest things to know, not because it was complicated, but because it required you to hold 2 contradictory things at the same time: the belief that the system was worth saving and the knowledge that the system was actively working against the thing you were trying to save it from. "What made you call me tonight?" she said. Specifically tonight, after the operation was stood down. He met her eyes. Because if the operation had been stood down, it meant someone inside the system had seen what I had been trying to show people for 14 months. And if someone had seen it, I wanted to make sure they saw all of it. She picked up her phone and called Farrell. 1 ring. "I'm sending you a portfolio," she said. "Varga's documentation. 2 subjects in the procurement oversight office, including the deputy director. Possible third connection through a law firm. I need the counterintelligence team's financial forensics unit on this tonight. A pause that was shorter than she expected. I'm going to tell you something, Farrell said. The third name on my preliminary concern list. Yes, it's the deputy director of the procurement oversight office. The room seemed to compress slightly. The particular sensation of a pattern completing, of the last piece finding its place in a structure you had been building for a long time. You knew, Amelia said. I had a suspicion. I didn't have documentations. Now I have documentation. Varga's been trying to report this for 14 months. I know. Farrell's voice was quieter than usual. His internal reports were reviewed and closed by people who were connected to what he was reporting. He was talking into a system that was designed not to hear him. Amelia looked at Varga across the table. He was watching her face again, reading what he could from the half of a conversation he was hearing. She saw the moment he understood from her expression that the person on the phone had confirmed something significant. His jaw tightened, not with relief, with the particular controlled anger of someone who had been right for a very long time, and was only now finding out exactly how comprehensively the system around him had been arranged to ensure that his being right would not matter. I'll transmit the portfolio in the next 30 minutes, she said. Good. And Commander, the 24-hour window still applies. After this transmission, you stand down, understood? She ended the call. She looked at Varga. The deputy director of the procurement oversight office is a named subject in an ongoing counterintelligence investigation. Your documentation connects directly to that investigation and will be transmitted to the federal team tonight. She paused. You were right. You were right from the beginning, and the people who closed your reports were connected to the thing you were reporting. That's not a process failure. That's a deliberate suppression of a legitimate investigation by people who had the access and authority to suppress it. He said nothing for a moment. His hands were on the table, not flat like Caldwell's or Klein's, but loosely interlaced, the posture of someone who had been holding on for a long time and was carefully, tentatively, beginning to consider letting go. Will it hold, he said. The case. Will it be enough to actually, he stopped. She understood what he wasn't finishing. Will it be enough to matter? Will it be enough to actually reach the people it needs to reach? Or will there be another layer above this one that closes another report and the machine continues? I don't know, she said. I can't promise you a specific outcome. What I can tell you is that the documentation you built is solid. Your sourcing is traceable and verifiable. And the investigation that was running parallel to everything you were trying to report has been building a case from the outside in for 7 months. Your portfolio is the piece that closes the gap between the financial architecture and the institutional access. She looked at him steadily. It will hold. He exhaled slow, long, the exhale of 14 months. All right, he said. She spent the next 20 minutes photographing every page of the portfolio with a secure device and transmitting the files to Farrell's team. Varga sat across from her while she worked and drank the cold coffee that had been sitting on the table since before she arrived, because people who had been waiting a long time for something developed a particular indifference to the quality of their immediate circumstances. When the transmission was complete, she gave him a contact number for the counterintelligence team and a case reference that would ensure his documentation was properly attributed and his status as a cooperating source formally protected. She stood to leave. Commander Voss, he said. She stopped. I want to ask you something. He looked at her with the particular directness of someone who had been diplomatic for a long time and had recently decided that diplomacy had a cost that exceeded its utility. When you walked into that command center this morning with your visitor badge and your corner seat, did you know it was going to work? She thought about Caldwell's expression when she had revealed the Trident, about the MP stepping back, about the folder on the table and the credentials page and the room going still in the way rooms went still when something fundamental shifted. I knew the evidence was real, she said. The rest I had to find out in real time. He studied her face. That took courage, he said. Not as a compliment, exactly as a statement of fact, the way an analyst stated facts. It took less courage than 14 months of filing reports that kept getting closed, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his briefcase lighter now, without the portfolio, and stood and nodded at her once with the particular respect of one professional acknowledging another in a context that did not require anything more elaborate than that. She walked out. The drive back to Fort Adams took 19 minutes. She spent them reconstructing the full architecture of what the investigation now contained: the original procurement records, the source routing trace, the surveillance tasking closures, Hargrove's authentication credentials, Klein's 26 minutes of off-record disclosure, Varga's portfolio, and now Farrell's confirmation of the deputy director as a named subject. 7 months of work in 1 day in a command center. One woman in a corner seat with a visitor badge and a folder and a jacket with something underneath it that changed the temperature of the room when it came off. At 21:15, she walked back into Fort Adams and found Caldwell still in his office. She had not expected him to be there. It was past 2100 on a day that had started before dawn for most of the people in the building. But he was at his desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the forearm, and a legal pad covered in handwriting that told her he had been thinking very hard for a long time about something that required paper. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Commander." He gestured at the chair across from him. "Sit down." She sat. "The counterintelligence team briefed me 40 minutes ago," he said. "The Procurement Oversight Office, the deputy director." "Yes." He looked at his legal pad. "I've been making a list," he said. "Every decision I made today that I would make differently if I made it again." He paused. "It's a long list." She waited. "The arrest order is at the top." He looked up, followed by every moment between the beginning of the briefing and the arrest order when I could have listened differently, when I could have asked different questions instead of looking for confirmation of what I already believed. He set down his pen. "I want to understand how I got here, not as an excuse, as an education." "You got here the same way every system gets here," she said. "You trusted the structure. The structure was compromised. The compromise was designed specifically to survive that trust." She met his eyes. "That's not a personal failure of judgment. That's a systemic failure that required significant resources and multiple people working together over 14 months to construct. The question isn't how you were deceived. The question is what changes so it can't happen again." He looked at her. What changes? She thought about what she had said to Webb in the corridor, the break-it review, the designated independent analysis that existed not to confirm the package, but to break it, to come in not from the outside with the specific mandate to find the seam. She told him. He listened the way he had not listened in the command center that morning, without the calculation of what the listening would cost him, without the protective certainty that had made the arrest order feel like authority and had actually been fear. He listened the way a person listened when they had arrived through a difficult path at genuine humility. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You'd run it," he said. "The break-it review. If I proposed to the Joint Chiefs as a new protocol, not me specifically, but the methodology is replicable. I can write the framework. I want you to write the framework." She looked at him. "That's a significant institutional proposal coming off 1 day's events. It's a significant institutional proposal coming off 14 months of corruption that almost killed 240 Americans and 12 to 15 Allied personnel," he said. "The 1 day's events were the part I could see. The rest was there the whole time." She nodded slowly. "I'll write the framework." He picked up his pen, put it down again. "Commander Voss, I want to say something to you that I should have said this morning before the arrest order, before any of it." She waited. "When you walked into this room and sat in that corner and opened your folder, I made a decision about what you were before you said a single word. I made it based on what I saw and what I assumed what I saw meant, and I held on to that decision, even when you gave me evidence that it was wrong, because changing it in front of my officers felt like it cost too much." He met her gaze directly. "That is not command. That is the thing that makes command dangerous. And I want you to know that I understand the difference. And that understanding it is the most important thing that happened to me today." Amelia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about every room she had ever sat in the corner of, every visitor badge, every calculation she had watched happen in someone's face when they looked at her and decided what they were seeing before she had spoken. Every moment when the evidence she put in front of people was filtered through what they had already decided about the person presenting it. She thought about a SEAL Trident underneath a plain tactical jacket, about carrying the thing that changed the room's temperature while the room didn't know it was there. She thought about Varga filing his 14th report into a system that had been arranged not to hear him, and about Farrell saying, "Watch your back in that building," and about Harrison's shaking hands and Webb's cracked voice, and the lieutenant colonel who had turned to face the wall for 3 seconds before she turned back. She thought about 240 soldiers who would wake up tomorrow morning frustrated about a mission hold and who would never fully know what they had been pulled back from. General Caldwell, she said. The apology this morning was enough. What matters now is the framework. He held her gaze. Then he picked up his pen. Tell me where to start, he said. She told him. They worked for 2 hours. It was not a comfortable 2 hours. It was the particular productive discomfort of two people who had started the day in direct opposition, working toward a shared goal with enough honest understanding of each other's limitations that neither of them had to pretend. He pushed back where he had specific institutional knowledge she lacked. She held firm where the methodology required independence he was instinctively resistant to. They argued twice in ways that were direct and uncomfortable and resolved into something better than either of their original positions. At 23:22, she had a 12-page draft framework that would eventually become the foundation of a Joint Chiefs proposal for independent adversarial intelligence review, a formal protocol mandating that any high-priority target package undergo a designated break-it analysis by a team with no access to the confirmation review's conclusions, no institutional relationship with the planning command, and explicit authorization to challenge, dismantle, and contradict the package without consequence. It would take 14 months to pass through the institutional review process. It would face significant resistance from commands who understood that the protocol would sometimes stop their missions. It would be amended 6 times before it reached final form, but it would pass. And on the day it passed, Caldwell's name would be on the proposal as primary, and Amelia's name would appear in the framework document as originating author, and the 240 soldiers who had never known how close they came would go about their day without knowing that the thing that had been built partly to protect the next version of them had just cleared its final institutional hurdle. Amelia would not be in the room when it passed. She would be somewhere she could not name, doing something she could not describe, with a team of people whose names would not appear in any document. She was at Fort Adams on this night for the last time. She left Caldwell's office at 23:40. She walked the corridor past the portraits one final time. She thought about Varga in his annex with his lighter briefcase. She thought about Farrell's financial forensics team pulling the deputy director's transaction records at this hour. She thought about Hargrove in his secure facility and Klein in his, and about the specific gravity of decisions that could not be undone. She thought about a mountainside, 7 operators, the silence of things that never appeared in documents. She had come to Fort Adams to find a seam in a corrupted system and had found it. She had come to stop an operation that would have destroyed evidence and killed allies, and she had stopped it. She had come to do a job that nobody was supposed to know existed, and she had done it in a room full of people who had decided she spoke what she was and was not capable of, and she had let the evidence speak until the evidence was loud enough to reach through the decision they had already made. She had not done it to prove anything. She had done it because 240 people needed someone to do it, and she was the person in the room. Outside, the October cold was deeper now than it had been at 1819. She stood in it for a moment before she walked to the transportation pool. She did not put on the tactical jacket. She held it in her left hand, the trident facing outward, the insignia catching the light from the building behind her. She was 28 years old. She had survived things that had no names in official records. She had sat in corners and carried truth in rooms that tried to remove her and held firm when holding firm was the only move available. She had built a case from a procurement anomaly for 7 months and walked it into a command center and laid it on a table in front of a 4-star general who had tried to put her in handcuffs, and she had been right. And the rightness had mattered at a cost to herself that she had accepted before she walked through the door. She had asked for no recognition and would receive some anyway, and she would carry the commendation the same way she carried everything quietly, without letting it change the weight distribution of what she was carrying. She had one more thing to do. She called Farrell. Deputy Director is confirmed, Farrell said, before she could speak. Financial forensics found the transaction link in the first 40 minutes. We have enough to move. Good. Are you standing down? Yes, she said. Starting now. 72 hours, Commander. I mean it. A pause. Then Farrell said something she had said only once before in the 4 years Amelia had worked for her. I want you to know that what you did today, all of it, from the first report 7 months ago to tonight, is exactly the kind of work that makes the difference between a system that survives its corruption and a system that gets consumed by it. Amelia stood in the October cold and held the jacket and said nothing for a moment. "Go get some rest," Farrell said. "The work will be here when you wake up." The line closed. She walked to the transportation pool. She got into the car. She set the jacket on the seat beside her and watched Fort Adams recede through the rear window, the lights, the buildings, the system inside the system that was, tonight, more honest than it had been this morning, which was all you could ask of any institution on any given day. She thought about the 240 sleeping soldiers, safe in the understanding that tomorrow was still coming. She thought about Varga filing one final report this time into a system that was listening. She thought about Webb building the break-it review into his planning process because he was the kind of officer who learned from the things that had nearly broken him, and the thing that nearly broke him today had broken him in exactly the right direction. She thought about a four-star general at his desk in the small hours, writing a proposal that would spend 14 months changing the institution that had spent 40 years defining him, because he had looked at a 28-year-old commander in a corner seat and learned, at considerable cost, that the most important voice in the room was not always the loudest, the oldest, or the one wearing the most stars. The car moved through the gate and onto the open road, and Fort Adams disappeared behind her, and Amelia Voss leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for the first time in 19 hours. She had walked into a room full of powerful people who decided what she was before she spoke. She'd been dismissed, underestimated, and ordered arrested in front of witnesses. She had been 28 years old with a visitor badge and a corner seat and a folder full of evidence that nobody wanted to see. And she had made them see it anyway. Not because she was louder than anyone in the room. Not because she outranked them. Not because she had performed her way into authority through any mechanism that required their permission. But because she had done the work, and the work was real, and real work, the kind that is done without applause in corners of rooms where nobody is watching, was the only kind that ever actually changed anything. That was the thing she had always known, long before Fort Adams, long before the mountainside, long before any room that had tried to define her by where she was sitting. The truth does not need permission to be true. It only needs someone willing to carry it through the door. Amelia Voss had always been that person. And on this night, in a car moving through the October dark, with her jacket on the seat beside her and 72 hours of earned rest ahead of her, she closed her eyes and let herself, for once, be exactly that, nothing more, nothing less, and entirely enough.